All right, thank you folks. Thank you for coming and welcome to PostCon. All right, before we start, so with a show of hands, how many of you like GitHub? Awesome. And how many of you like Postman? Awesome. So what I feel like after the talk, the whole room will like the Postman and the GitHub integration. Awesome. Cool. So yeah, so we tried to create a new integration with the GitHub and the Postman, and this is what the talk is all about. And as the talk says, APIs at scale, we need to build smart, ship fast with GitHub and Postman. Before we get started, let's do a round of introduction. My name is Pankaj Khandelwal. I'm currently working as an engineer managing Postman, and my team was responsible for building this particular integration. Yasir?
Hi, folks. My name is Yasir Alibrahem. I'm a strategic solutions engineer in GitHub. I primarily focus on financial services, but previously worked with the tech sector, healthcare, manufacturing, and now really just dedicated on FSI.
Cool. All right, so before we get into the integration, let's talk about the pain points, right? We have heard a whole lot of issues with the current workflow that we have. We got a whole lot of feedback from you folks, right? And few of the major pain points that we feel is like the first one is the disjointed change management, right? Which is a real major pain point, right? So when people work with the APIs, creating APIs and developing APIs, there are two major workflows that happens. One is the code management and one is the API testing. And both of these workflows are really disjointed. The second major pain point that we have discovered is that the code review is actually very difficult and time consuming. It doesn't give you the right context of what exactly is changing between the two different versions. And the third one is the testing gap. We understand that when the APIs that you created and developed needs to be tested well. And these needs to be tested well on a more automated basis in your CI/CD pipelines, right? But somehow, you are not able to use the Postman CLI or Newman because of the testing gaps that exist. And last but not the least is the collaboration between the teams is really, really broken, right? Folks cannot, because of the lack of a better integration between Postman and GitHub, people have a whole lot of issues with their workflows, and they are not able to debug and test fast and better. Yes, sir.
All right, so we'll go ahead and talk about a workflow where we can use the two platforms together easier and with a more seamless approach. A couple of touch points you'll see in GitHub is we can use GitHub Copilot, and we'll go over a little bit of a demo of that today. And we use GitHub Copilot to either author the actual source code or to author the workflows that you can take that source code, package it, and actually deploy it, so the entire CI/CD part. In addition, the GitHub Actions is the CI/CD infrastructure that enables that, and we can show how with GitHub Actions you can actually accomplish building APIs, testing APIs in a very, very rapid manner and actually iterate and ship faster with that.
Along with that, what we have also seen is that how easily you can make any changes into your collection, which directly syncs with your GitHub repository. Also, as I mentioned in the pain points, right, the PR review process is very disjointed, doesn't give you the right experience. And this is what we are fixing this with the new integration. We want to provide a more collaborative, more semantic understanding of what exactly is changing in your PR between the two versions. And last but not the least is how you can make sure that your APIs are well tested before you deploy it to your production, and that is where the CI/CD pipelines comes into the picture with the help of GitHub Actions.
Awesome. Thank you, Pankaj. All right, so the first part of the presentation here is taking a new project and actually building an API endpoint from scratch. And one of the challenges we see in GitHub, and you probably see in Postman a lot, is testing an API is not that simple. It takes a little bit of time. You start with writing a spec, maybe you start with an idea, but then not everybody within the team can actually go ahead and iterate over the idea. And eventually you have to rely on engineers to go ahead and take the time, and maybe they don't have that time. So what we're trying to do here is showcase how using Postman and GitHub and that integration and how you can learn to use these two tools together. If you're a product manager, if you're a test engineer, if you're a data analyst, perhaps you're a business person, perhaps you just really want to ideate on a personal project. And what we're going to show here is how you can do that within maybe 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and you're actually good to go. We decided to keep the movie theme since we have Ryan Reynolds here. And then this is a very basic movie database that we're going to expose using 2 or 3 API endpoints. So instead of using a complex database, we're just going to start with a JSON file where we're going to store in our repository. And then within GitHub, we're doing the change tracking, we're doing the source code, the code review, the pull request. Also within GitHub, we're going to use the tools we just mentioned, GitHub Actions, GitHub Copilot. The integration goes to Postman, where we're going to show, with Pankaj is going to show us how we can do some tests and how we can use those collections to actually iterate and create new endpoints and track that progress. And then I've chosen to deploy this application live so that if you were to share it with your coworkers or your friends or family for your project, you can actually share something live and deployed. And we're going to show that all today. The service we're going to see here on the right side is called Azure App Service. It's one of the simplest ways to get an application running. And really, that's because if you have a container, you can just ship it to this service using what's called the publish profile. So let's go ahead and start with the setup. In here, you have this repository. It's called the Postcon Film API. You can see in the README, I actually took a little bit of time to be specific. It's a microservice that exposes an API endpoint. There is a tech stack description, and I'm saying it's a JavaScript. I did specify a little bit about how I want to structure my code, how I want to test it, document it, and also a little bit about the CI/CD elements of that. You don't have to be that precise, but I do think that it's good practice to start with a little bit of pre-thought documentation. On the end state, where you can see this is the Azure App Service, you have a new URL where you can actually access this application. And you take that publish profile, you download it, and it's just sort of an encrypted text. I'm going to go ahead to the repository settings, and I'm going to jump into the secrets, because in GitHub, you can store those kind of secrets so that you can use them in GitHub Actions or GitHub environments. And you can see it's stored as an Azure Web App Publish Profile secret. So I don't have to actually go ahead and integrate Vault or worry about the encryption or compromise the security. Let's get actually started with implementation. So what you see here is VS Code. If the screen is not that clear, I can talk you through this. But here, I have an OpenAPI spec file. It's extremely simple. I've got 2 endpoints. One is called /movies, where I query the entire data set. And then there's another endpoint where, by the way, this is the data set itself. So this is a JSON movies file. And there's another endpoint that you see here, which is movies/title/ you actually insert that title. And here, you're trying to query a specific movie by its title. All right, so we're going to pull up GitHub Copilot. And if you've never used this, all you need is to subscribe to the service. This experience is built into VS Code. You have this sort of chat interface to work with. And you have a couple of options. If you just want to use it as a chatbot, you can use the Ask mode for just Q&A. If you go with an agent mode, you're actually authorizing it to suggest code, but also work through problems as it discovers them. You can also, if you're a developer and you're opinionated, you can choose the model you want to work with. I know that Claude Sonnet has been very popular with developers, so that's a very common one, but right now, by default, GPT 4.1 is the base. Next, we're going to provide the model some context. You drag and drop those files that we prepared, the README, the JSON database, the spec, and you start to give it the prompt where you're letting Copilot actually build the API endpoint for you using the prep work you've done. So we'll start writing, and maybe, all right, create a new branch. What do you think the prompt should be? I think it's going to be very specific here. We're going to say something like, based on my OpenAPI spec file, and I'm going to actually just be specific and say it's called OpenAPI.yaml. And based on that spec file, generate the source code for my application, and I'm just going to enter a few details for the model to take into account. First, I'm just going to say use the JavaScript stack, just specifying how I want the code to be written in a framework I'm familiar with. If you're not, don't worry about it. You don't have to worry about that. The second is I'm going to say use that movies JSON as a data source to start. I'm also going to instruct to add some instruction, documentation, add unit testing. In addition, I'm going to say make sure that there's a web page that resembles the Postman design, just for fun. All right? And finally, another instruction that I like to include here is update the README file with instructions on how I can test this application you've just built for me. And then we're gonna, okay, here's the last prompt. Once this prompt is ready, we have the context set up. We can just ask Copilot to start actually implementing this application. And so we're gonna go ahead and click enter. You see on the right side, Copilot is actually starting to work, and it's showing you exactly step by step what it's doing. So it's created a few files. In here you can see it's using that specific context, the README, the JSON database, and you can click through the files it's creating here. In here, for example, you can see that there's an app.js. This is the main JavaScript entry point for the application. You can also see how there is a keep. Once the job is done, there's going to be a keep blue button where you can just accept all the code. Because if you don't, you can just ask for some changes, or you can actually edit the code yourself a little bit, depending on how comfortable you are. So Copilot is iterating. It generated a few files, including a movies.json. Some of them are still generating. Now, this is the agentic work. Is not as fast as light speed, where in 200 milliseconds you get the code in front of you. It's actually iterating over this, and you can watch it do this entire chunk of work. All right. So now we have a few files created. Copilot is going to go ahead and try to actually run the application and make sure that when you build it, it builds successfully. This is where a lot of errors actually happen before we got to this agentic state. And so the first job is to run npm install, where you can just install some packages so that you can start to run the application locally. All right, we're running this. If you see in the terminal that red means that npm install actually failed. What's going to happen is Copilot is going to go and on its own take that terminal output, feed it back to the model, find the solution, and just work through it. You don't have to worry about it. So what it did is it actually updated the, I believe it is the packages file, and then reran npm install where it succeeded, and ran the tests now. And we can see that, I don't know if it's that clear, but you have 2 test suites, and they both were successful in green. At this point, I have an application. It's telling me that it's actually running, tells me that it's good. I just need to test it out right now and see if it actually does that. So I'm going to go ahead and accept all these changes. Just looking through these files a little bit. All right. And then once we're ready, click keep. And so we have those files actually created. Let's try to run this locally. And so I'm going to go ahead and jump to the README file. Copilot added the instructions where I can run this application locally. I'm going to go to that section, and you see there's a little bit of npm start. So when I start my npm application, it's running on my local host, port 3000, jump back to a browser, fingers crossed, open the website, and we have this web page with a text box exactly as we instructed it. And we're going to try something like inception, and we see immediately the results are put down. So within, what was this, 6 minutes, we started with a good amount of work, and we have basically asked Copilot with one prompt, with the right setup, how it can build a full API endpoint. If I was a product manager, maybe this is good for me. I want to iterate over my product before I pass it to engineering. If I'm an engineer, I just actually did my task within 6 minutes, which is amazing. Now this is running locally. Let's go ahead and actually push next and try to implement this to share publicly using that Azure App Service. So back to the IDE, we're going to try to write another prompt. And now we actually drag all the source files you saw there that we just created into the chat to give that as part of the context for the model. And then we're going to write the second prompt to generate the CI/CD workflows that we need to get this out and deployed. So we're going to say something, for example, generate the required CI/CD workflows to build and deploy my applications, and then add a few steps. I will say this is where probably some technical experience is helpful in telling the model how exactly you want to deploy, especially that you're actually going to consume resources now. This is not only running on your local machine. If you deploy to a provider or somewhere, a service, you're starting to incur some billing. And so in here, I'm instructing the model to A, start with writing a Docker file, B, to take that Docker file and create a container and publish it to the GitHub container registry. To me, that's easy because I have a GitHub account. It's going to be probably free for me on that quota. And then I can take that container and tell the model to use the Azure Web App Publish profile that I stored as a GitHub secret to actually deploy to the GitHub Azure, to the Azure service. And finally, of course, you want to tell the model, implement all the required GitHub actions. Audio's out, thanks. Implement all the CI/CD actions in CI/CD workflows in GitHub Actions so that you can actually get this work done. And once we're ready, we also click Start. Copilot is running, and I can see that the Docker file is created. There's an image, the Alpine image, and then you install the packages, you copy the source code, and you expose it. Very straightforward, looks good to me. What else? Here we're actually looking at the GitHub Actions workflow to do the CI/CD. And that on statement says this workflow is going to run whenever I push to the main branch or when I push manually. Now, I do think it's nice to actually say run this workflow when there's a pull request to the main branch. So I'm just going to add that myself to the workflow. And then when I inspect the workflow, it has a few steps in that job. So it starts with, this is a virtual machine running on GitHub's infrastructure. All you have to do is say, run this on an Ubuntu machine. Step 1 is copy the source code. Step 2 is initiate Docker. Step 3, it seems to be log into the GitHub container registry. 4, to actually build a package, and 5, to deploy it. So very much following my instructions, very much looks good to me. And it looks like the job is done. And now I'm going to commit the changes in the terminal and publish this branch to my remote GitHub repository. We're going to publish it so that we can actually run this workflow, actually create a container, and actually deploy the container and see if the application runs successfully. All right, so here's the push. We got to jump back to GitHub. We should be getting prompted. Yep, there we go. Get prompted to create a pull request. Create that pull request. Honestly, this is a huge chunk of work. These are way too many lines of code to submit in one pull request, but we're vibe coding a little bit here, so it's not a big deal. And then just put in a little bit of a description into the pull request, create it, and you're going to see all your jobs run and execute. So in here, the job that's going to go ahead and build the artifact, deploy the artifact, is running. We can see it turned green, so now I can merge my pull request. And when I go back to the repository in the packages, I see a package. So I know at least that I have a container ready. And I didn't even write any lines of code myself. I have the container, the job, the workflow ran, which means I'm expecting it to be deployed. So I'm going to go back to Azure App Service, look up the URL of this application, and copy it, and let's go ahead and test the endpoint. There we go. And so this time, this application is actually live and it's actually deployed, and I can just have any of my coworkers test it publicly. And again, I didn't, within 10 minutes, maybe 12 minutes, we managed to get this entire application set up and this endpoint live. So now we're gonna go ahead and maybe test the specific endpoint to get a title, add that into your URL, /title/inception, and you can see you only got the JSON output for whatever matches inception. As an engineer at this point in time, my job is done, 15 minutes. I'm gonna grab a coffee, take a walk, and I'm gonna go back and say, hey, Pankaj, my endpoint is deployed. Please proceed with testing using Postman.
Awesome. I think that was really magical, right? And given what we saw in the speaker, like the keynote, right, the agent mode in the Postman, this is another magical thing that I'm seeing today. Perfect. So let's take a step back and understand what we have done so far. So we have a productionized API endpoints, and we have these things running on the production, right? Now, the next thing that we want to do is make sure that we are able to test these endpoints on a regular basis. Awesome. So we'll head back to the Postman. So what we'll be starting is the same spec that Yasir used to create the endpoints. We'll take the spec, copy it, and head back to Postman, import this spec as a collection into Postman. So once the collections is created, we'll just make sure that all the endpoints is working fine. Definitely verify it before you're making sure, right? I'll change the name of the movie to Inception, one of the best movies I've seen. Perfect. I'll send the request. I get the responses, too many inceptions over there. I'll make sure that each of the endpoints that was created is working fine. Perfect. The second one looks good. Even the third one. Awesome. So all the endpoints are working fine. The next thing that I want to make sure is we add a good amount of test cases to it, right? So I'll use Postbot over here, which will generate a whole lot of tests for these endpoints. AI into picture. Perfect. Looks good. I'll add those test scripts to my endpoints. Again, I'll make sure that the test scripts are working fine. Send the request, head back to the test tab, 505, looking good. Right. The next thing I want to do is make sure I connect this collection to my repository, authenticate myself, give it the right configuration, select the right organization, repository, connect it to the developer branch. Ideally, this is a blueprint collection, so you should be connecting to a branch which is protected and which is the one which you can use for the blueprint part. Connect it to the repository. Perfect, looks good. Again, I'll just make sure that it is actually connected to a repository. So I'll go ahead, go into GitHub. All right, so here's the collection that we have in our Postman. Awesome. So one more thing that is left to do is making sure that we add the CI/CD pipelines to it, right? So I'll head back to collection runner, click on it, get the GitHub Actions config over here. I'll copy it from here, head back to GitHub, create a new GitHub Actions under workflows. Give it a more proper name, maybe like API automated API test. So the config that I copied, I'll just paste it over here. One thing that I want to do is I don't want to log in into it because the test that will be running is from my local JSON file that's there in my repository, so I'll remove the login part. Another thing that I want to do is make sure I get the right path to the file. So I'll head back to GitHub, copy the file path, and replace my collection ID with the file path. So essentially what we are doing over here is we are running the CI/CD pipelines with the local repository collection JSON that we have. Commit the changes. Okay, good. Perfect. I'll head back to the Actions tab. If you see, there's one action that's running. If we expand on this, so we have all the endpoints that is there in your collection being automated and tested on your CI/CD pipelines. That's it.
Right, and just to be clear, so the CI/CD workflows that we ran initially were to build a package, build the source code, and then deploy it. But the second workflow that you showed was specific to testing the endpoint. Okay, awesome. And both of these you're gonna run on GitHub Actions. You don't have to actually set up any infrastructure or worry about that part. Now let's take another example. Let's take that existing endpoint, and let's say you want to just add a new endpoint to your existing API collection. I think from a GitHub perspective, you're getting the gist here. You really have to stage up the right context and the right prompt and ask Copilot to do at least the majority of the work. So in here, we go back and we're gonna ask chat, GitHub Copilot, agent mode, we're gonna say, here's that OpenAPI spec file for my collection. Now this could be also a collection file, this could be a text file. It really depends on how you've described it. I personally like the spec. I appreciate the YAML and JSON syntax. And what I'm gonna do here is use Copilot to actually update the spec itself and say, update my OpenAPI spec and create a new endpoint to query this data set using the director, let's say, for example. So I'm not even gonna go ahead and take my 3, 4 minutes, 5 minutes to do this manually, maybe have some typos. I'm just gonna put this in the prompt. And then once you're done, implement the source code changes for this new endpoint. Also, once you do that, make sure unit tests are covered, the code is documented well, that the CI/CD pipelines are updated and they're still running successfully, and then update your UI so that there's another search by director box that's clear. So I think one of the ways, one of the best practices of using this tool is to be really as specific as possible with how you want it to perform. There are custom instructions that you can embed when you start to use it, Copilot, in a more advanced way, where you can sort of natively ask Copilot to take these into account without having to repeat them every single prompt. But for the sake of the demo, we're just being very precise and very specific here. All right, so the prompt is ready. I'm gonna create a new branch. This is a new chunk of code. And all right, we click go. You can see immediately Copilot went ahead to the spec. And this green section is the diff. This is the new code. If you expand it, you have a new endpoint, query by director. You can see there is the endpoint and a 200 and a 404 response. So that's very straightforward. Let's see what else is going on. Okay, I believe this is the service, the movie service. You can see there's a new function to actually query the movie by director. So now we're looking at the JavaScript code itself. Going back, now we're updating the movies JavaScript file. Also very straightforward. Looks good to me. And I'm tracking Copilot and seeing how it actually works. Now this is the UI. I can see there's a new div in my web page with a text box and an input and a button. Looks good to me as well. And now it's trying to actually run the test. I'm gonna authorize it. You're still in charge. You're still the human in the loop that's letting the agent run. And it's trying to install a linter, ESLint. That's a really good suggestion, honestly. So install that package. Looks like terminal worked really well, and now we're gonna run our tests, run the tests, and we're expecting to see all the test suites, the unit testing here that we've done just run successfully. And looking at the terminal, it looks like we have a green pass. So the application is ready. Copilot summarizes the changes. I am happy with it. I'm gonna say keep those changes. Now I'll show you another trick in GitHub Copilot. Once you go to your code review and pull request on that left side, you can actually get a code review using Copilot, and this is all in your IDE. So at the top, there is sort of this tags icon, and if you just click that, it takes the diff, and this is the code that maybe the model has written, maybe code you've written in a separate project. And before you push this code to the pull request where you work on it with your team, with other people publicly, you want to just do a first dry run, a first review with Copilot. It'll probably catch a lot of syntax, it'll probably catch some security incidents, clearly. And it does take a few seconds. So now it completed, it didn't find anything. Now it's prompting me to put a commit message, and I'm going to publish this new branch. Awesome. Create a pull request. If you're familiar with VS Code, you can either do the PR in your IDE, or you can just go back to GitHub and do it. Same. And put in a little description, create my PR. Of course, the same kind of workflow is going to run now. We know this ran. We know the code built successfully. We implemented another endpoint with, again, one prompt. By now, you're getting used to this. This is how you can use GitHub Copilot to create code, to review code, and to update code. I go back, I look at my pull requests, and if it passes, then I'm just going to say this task is done. There's a yellow circle, which means the GitHub Actions job is running, and it looks like all checks have passed. I think I'm good to go here. That's a new endpoint. All right, let's merge this pull request, and we should be good. Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and say, OK, Pankaj, my new endpoint is deployed. Again, please go ahead and proceed with testing.
Awesome. So we have a new endpoint getting deployed. Now all we need to do, make sure, is we go back to our collections, the blueprint collection, and it should have the new endpoint. But one thing we need to make sure is that we don't make the changes into the blueprint collection directly, right? And that is where the forking flows comes into picture. As you know, right, so blueprint collection, a protected collection, we don't want to make direct changes to it. So we go ahead to GitHub, create a new branch, which will be linking it to the fork collection. Let's say, maybe feed new endpoint branch. All right, so we have a new branch. We'll head back to Postman. In here, we'll click on the right-click menu, fork the collection, and over here, we'll see a few new changes, and we need to make sure that we add it to the right workspace and connect it to the new branch that we created. And once you create the fork, it gets added to your workspace. And this is where what we'll be doing is we'll be adding the new endpoint that Yasir just created, which is getting the movie titles by director. So we'll go ahead and add a new request. Give it a proper name. Get movies by director. Right? Cool. So I have a call request added to it, so which converts into a request. I'll send the request, and I get the response. Perfect. Looks good. I'll again make sure that I add the proper test cases to it. Use Postbot again for creating the test cases. All right. Magic is happening. We have the new test cases added. Make few changes in test cases because maybe this is not exactly a well-working endpoint, not a performant one. So I'll make changes into the amount of time it should return. So 2000 seconds. Test it again. All right, my test cases are working fine. Looks good. So I'll just go back to GitHub and see the changes. I'll switch to the history tab and see what are the commits that got added. If you see the last commit, this is where the the endpoints was added, and the CI/CD pipeline is also running fine. And if you scroll to the last part, you'll see that the new endpoint that we just created was running as part of your CI/CD pipelines without anything that you need to do except for just adding it into the Postman. Cool. So we have created a fork collection. We have added a new endpoint. All we need to do is make sure that we create the PR request and get our blueprint collection updated with the new request. So this is where the diff view and the PR review changes comes into picture. Now, as you see that this is the collection in our feature branch, right? We'll just go ahead and create a pull request out of it. Set the right branches. So source is this one, base is the develop branch. Okay. Now, one thing you see is that there's a lot of changes in the collection JSON, which is not really good to understand what exactly changed between the two branches that we saw, right? So before that, let's just go ahead and give the right title to the PR, create the pull request. Now, the moment the PR request is created, there's one thing that we added is a comment that you see from the Postman, which says that view differences. So this is the one which we have added to make sure that your PR reviews are very, very truthful, and you are able to understand like what exactly changed between the two branches. So once you click on that particular link, it opens the PR view inside your Postman, and it gives a more semantic understanding of what exactly changed between the two versions of the collection, right? Again, not a very, so if you do it in the GitHub, it's not very prominent of what exactly changed, but if you do it in Postman, you have an understanding of, okay, a new request got added, you see the metadata about the request, or the URLs, the script got added, the method that we are using it, and so on, right? Everything looks good. We head back to Postman, to GitHub, and see that the CI/CD pipelines are also running fine, tests are running fine. We just go ahead and approve the request and merge it. So once the PR is merged, we head back to our Postman and go back to the blueprint collection. And we'll wait for a few seconds. And yeah, so here's it is. So your blueprint collection is updated with the new request that we just recently added.
All right, so that's a wrap. Just to summarize what we did see today, we leveraged GitHub Copilot to create the source code, update the source code, create the CI/CD pipelines, and actually take a spec to a fully live endpoint. So whatever pet project or business application, within 45 minutes, you're actually able to complete that task. Behind the scenes, we also saw how you can use GitHub Actions to enable all this deployment, running the tests, packaging the application, honestly, any type of CI or CD, for example, your security tooling, your coverage tooling, anything that comes to mind during your pipelines, you can just run that on GitHub Actions and do this within rapid shipping.
What we have also seen is that we have created a more seamless integration between Postman and GitHub. So any changes that you make into Postman goes directly into GitHub and vice versa. The other thing also we saw that the PR review process is much more streamlined, has more semantic understanding of what exactly is changing between the collections, and you are able to kind of make a sense out of it. Awesome. So if you want to learn more about the GitHub and the Postman integration, feel free to scan the code.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.